Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. This is a fully independent podcast. Lend your support at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. And also please like, share, and subscribe on YouTube. Gunar Olsen's here today, and he recently published a response to an historian's analysis of the Soviet Afghan invasion and the question of whether or not Zbigniew Brzezinski's goal under the Carter administration in assisting the mujahedin was really about provoking the Soviet military intervention. There's also a bonus question on why there was so much pushback and resistance to Trump's last-ditch efforts to withdraw troops from Afghanistan, and what are the real reasons behind it. Gunar Olsen is an independent scholar, a writer, and a journalist, and he covers the politics of U.S. imperialism. His articles have been published in The New Republic, The Nation, Jacobin, Grayzone, and Fair, and other publications. He also provides research for the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Gunar Olsen's here talking to us from New York City. Hello, Gunar. Welcome to the show, and thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me, Joanne, a long-time listener.
Yeah, we were trying to figure out how long we've been sort of connected via social media, because I guess I have similar foreign policy interests and things like that. And I'm not even sure. It's at least been a number of years. But since it's the first time on the show, take a couple minutes to talk about yourself, if you would.
Certainly. I do a bit of freelance writing, journalism, somewhat more academic stuff these days. About U.S. foreign relations, the politics of U.S. imperialism. I've covered things like politics of Congress's war powers and this constant call we hear to reassert Congress's war powers. I've written about Israel-Palestine. I graduated in 2017 from Fordham University with a bachelor's degree in political science. At Fordham, I co-founded a chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine, which we ended up having to sue the school over because, eventually the student government voted to approve our application to become a club, but the dean of students vetoed that vote and said that we could not become a club because our politics were polarizing. So we sued them and we won. We won a lawsuit. It's being challenged right now, but I ended up writing a piece about it for The Nation magazine, discussing all of the sort of intricate details of that case. Beyond that, I work at a restaurant to pay rent. I also am a part-time research assistant for the newly founded Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. I've been there.
You scored a job there. That's great.
Just a very part-time thing, but yeah, that I'm happy to be with them. Very, very happy to be with them.
Yeah, that's great. And sounds like, I hear a lot of people very similar in your situation. Kudos for you for being able to keep yourself going while you do the work that you want to do. I know it's not easy.
Yeah. I'm happy to, have a job that allows me to do things on my days off that I enjoy.
Yeah, exactly. So today we're going to talk about an article that Gunar recently published. Really interesting. It's titled, "We Don't Need a Smoking Gun, U.S. Provocations in the Soviet Invasion of Afghanistan." And I think how this interview came about was that I had told you that I've always been really interested in Brzezinski. I haven't taken the time to really read all of his books and study him, but I followed him in the media and in various seminars. And then my interest was more increased during the Ukraine, from Maidan on through the Civil War and all that. And so that's how we got talking about this. And Gunnar said, I'm studying this, I'm writing an article on the whole idea of whether what Brzezinski said, and then kind of walked back about how much of a role the support of the mujahedin played in the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And he comes up with some pretty interesting conclusions, I think. I'm just going to read the first two paragraphs here. During the Cold War, U.S. interventions in the global South often transformed local issues into geopolitical pieces on the grand chessboard with grave humanitarian consequences for those in targeted states, whether Vietnam or El Salvador, The same remains true in post-Cold War world, as Washington's crusades into the Balkans, Iraq, Libya, and Syria have uprooted societies and made a new Cold War more likely. And then you say one string of U.S. interventions has outlived the passing of the Cold War like no other, Afghanistan. For critics of the U.S. global supremacy, Jimmy Carter's decision to initiate a CIA program of non-lethal aid to the mujahedin in July 1979 ranks among Washington's most disastrous and consequential gambits in modern history. They argue that the CIA program provoked Soviet invasion 6 months later, making the United States significantly responsible for the humanitarian catastrophe that unfolded during the next 9 years of war, the constant instability in Afghanistan for the past 4 decades, and the proliferation of Islamic extremism. And then I don't want to co-opt your work here, but so you go into the very interesting article, in which it keeps coming up. It's not just something that someone once in a while cites, but it's basically Zbigniew Brzezinski bragging about our role in, sort of luring the Soviets into Afghanistan, which then caused them to collapse. And then he later, and I forget which exact interview this is, he later walked that back, because after 9/11, of course, they're like, hey, Zbig, did you create Al-Qaeda? So that's sort of the really boiled down version of what the controversy has been. And you chose one scholar and his argument to study and to analyze, right?
That's right. I'm hoping that, this question of the Afghan trap, as it's called, and U.S. role in Soviet invasion of Afghanistan can sort of be put to rest by now. I mean, there has been a lot of work on it. It has been studied. I think Connor Tobin's piece in Diplomatic History, the one that I sort of review or respond to in my article, does a very, very good job at incorporating all of the elements into it. But I thought it left a few things out, which is why I wrote my piece. You referred to this 1998 interview that Zbigniew Brzezinski gave to the French magazine Les Nouvelles Observateur. He makes a number of sort of bombastic claims in that interview, as you mentioned, but he does, as you say, walk it back. There's sort of two places he sort of walks it back.
Yeah.
Paul Jay of the Real News Network interviewed him, I think in maybe 2010 or 12, and in that interview, Zbigniew Brzezinski said, "As far as the French interview is concerned, it was not an interview, but excerpts from an interview that was originally supposed to be published in full, but which they never checked with me for approval in the form that did appear." And so that was sort of like the transcript interview he's calling into question. But more broadly, on a content level, he did give an interview to the French historian Justin Weiss for Justin Weiss's biography of Brzezinski, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2018. And I think Justin Weiss interviewed Brzezinski maybe in 2010 or so. And the sort of walk back quote that gets referenced nowadays is this. Zbigniew Brzezinski says, "We didn't really trap them, but we knew what they were doing, and they knew what we were doing. And what we knew was that they were injecting themselves into Afghanistan. What happened is we knew they were injecting their forces into Afghanistan already in the summer. We also knew the mujahedin were resisting. So we first started to give them money 6 months before the Soviets went in. When we started to give them money, I told Carter, I think they'll go in. They'll probably use that as an excuse in part, but they're going in anyway because they are taking over the regime. So we didn't suck them in, but we knew what they were doing. Namely, we were in a sense engaging them in a preliminary skirmish prior to their more overt intervention." And I think that quote there from Brzezinski is the one that defines the historiography on this now, as exemplified by Connor Tobin's article in Diplomatic History that I reviewed. Tobin argues that this 1998 interview with Les Nouvelles Observateur has significant problems as a historical source, as we just discussed, but more interestingly and more original to his piece now is that it's unsupported by the historical record. So, he parses through the diplomatic record and presents a case that the Carter administration, including Brzezinski, were not interested in the Soviets invading Afghanistan. They really did not want that for a number of reasons. And I found his argument there to be fairly convincing. that would then undermine what we call the trap thesis, that Carter and Brzezinski were trying to trap the Soviets in what Brzezinski called, the day after the Soviets intervened, an Afghan quagmire, the Soviet Vietnam, essentially.
Yeah, and that's a term that has persisted.
Sure has.
Is it safe to assume that Brzezinski was National Security Advisor? Carter
Right.
was former Navy intelligence, I think. Is it safe to assume, and we have to think about what time this was. This was in the 1970s. So this is the post-Nixon era. There was a lot of turmoil. There was a lot of anti-war sentiment. We were just out of the Vietnam War. It was going to be hard to get us into any war after that. And also, now I have someone coming down the steps here.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ez. They always find a way to feature themselves in these podcasts.
No worries.
Anyway, in the 60s, it was pretty clear that Kennedy and even Nixon had serious disagreements with, let's say, the intelligence,
Mm-hmm.
Whatever their goals were, and also even like the chiefs of staff, that kind of thing. Is it safe to assume, do you think, that the CIA's goals were in line with Brzezinski's stated, White House goals, or even that Brzezinski's goals were the same as Jimmy Carter's? Is there a possibility that the things that scholars are able to refer to now, the papers and the policies and things like this, that in the classified stuff, there's a whole nother story,
Mm-hmm.
if that's a fair question?
Sure. Yeah, I think oftentimes Washington's policies are a little bit less coherent than we like to think they are, or that we like to make them out to be. And certainly there's always a lot of bureaucratic infighting. And in the case of the Carter administration, early on, Carter wanted to engage detente with the Soviet Union. He was at least tried to do that in a way that was sort of in line with the globalization and the global human rights movement. But toward the end of his administration, he firmly positioned himself as a Cold Warrior. Detente was dead by that point. Brzezinski was a Cold Warrior even from the beginning of the administration, as I understand it. A good book on this is Daniel Sargent's A Superpower Transformed. It's a really, really good interrogation of not only the Nixon years, but the Carter years and how that's working. But in the case of Afghanistan and the CIA, certainly the CIA wanted to get involved with with elements of the Afghan resistance pretty early on. As we know from a journalistic account of the 1970s in Afghanistan, the CIA was working with the Pakistan and Iranian intelligence agencies to funnel weapons to Islamic extremists at the time who were resisting the government of Mohammed Daoud in Afghanistan. And I think a lot of those connections made and weapons delivered probably eventually made the insurgency of 1979 a lot more possible than it did. And I would say, to answer your question directly, I would say it seems like CIA interest and Zbigniew Brzezinski's and Jimmy Carter's goals in Afghanistan were along the same lines, quite similar, I would say.
Okay, yeah, because in Syria, where you draw some parallels, and I think that the Syrian War, and I've said this a lot of times, it may not go down as like one of the biggest wars ever fought, but it was certainly one of the most revealing, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah, kind of bad for the empire, where I don't know whether they were so confident that they deliberately revealed certain things, or whether they got, whether things got chaotic, and I think maybe a little both. But
I mean, the amount of money and intensity poured into that PR campaign around Syria was just monstrous.
Yeah. And the goals of the CIA and the administration were never necessarily in line. Even I don't know. I was going to say with the State Department too, but John Kerry used to kind of waffle back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
So,
It's
and
very hard to
we,
delineate a policy in Syria, a clear policy in Syria.
well, yeah.
Yeah.
Other than other than regime change, I mean, what? Other than that, it was really
Right.
difficult to tell.
Right.
And then there's always the involvements of other allies too that get sort of downplayed. Some of the European allies, where sometimes they play a bigger role than they're given credit for, like with Libya. But anyway, I guess what I'm getting at is that the Syrian War kind of gives us more context for the things that you're talking about in Afghanistan.
Certainly. Yeah.
In terms of like strategies that they tend to use.
Right. In the early years of the Syrian civil war, the U.S. had not initiated its own covert arm and equip program yet. It was facilitating weapons transfers from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey at that time to the opposition in Syria until 2013, when Obama initiated, Washington's own arm and equip program, and ultimately, the strengthening of the insurgency in Syria provoked Russia, to begin its intervention in the Syrian war in October 2015 to shore up the Assad government, which was facing down a sort of a fanatical insurgency. And so it's important to look at how one U.S. intervention can sort of escalate a situation, can raise tensions. And I think, when looking at the Syrian war, that is one of probably the most fundamental question. Like, who is responsible here for the prolongation of the Syrian civil war? And I would say that it's, the United States, Syria, or the United States, Qatar, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia in their arming of the opposition, allowing the civil war, fueling it to continue. And now it's, more than 9 years now.
Right. Yeah. And in a quieter way, Israel. How about the other pop culture about the arming of the mujahedin, like the Charlie Wilson version?
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
So I have read the book by George Cryle, Charlie Wilson's War, and I have seen the film. They are both extremely fun, only because they are like hugely exaggerated. George Cryle really, really, really enjoys the Congressman Charlie Wilson's anti-communism and drinking problems.
The whole cowboy.
Big cowboy on a white horse in the mountains of Afghanistan. So it's very much a celebration of Charlie Wilson's politics and the courageous efforts that he made. It's a very fun read. There are definitely some correct things in there, obviously, and a lot is to be gained from reading that book. Students of the 1980s need to read that book to get a feel for it. The film is just as equally as fun. If you want to watch a fun movie, it's a good one.
Yeah, unless you think about like what the consequences of that whole thing was.
Of course. Yeah. 2 million Afghans dead in the 9-year war. It's a huge number.
So getting into the nature of the Cold War tactics at that time and mentalities, and the U.S. and the USSR always sort of keeping an eye on each other and and there was all kinds of intrigue and there were defectors and there were double, triple agents and this kind of thing. So they're always trying to figure out what that person's next move was. But what was their overall strategic, as you lay out in the article, what were they both really trying to do?
Well, I think that they were trying to counter Soviet influence in Afghanistan. I think that was really what Carter and Brzezinski wanted to do in a lot of ways. From 1973 to 1978, when Mohammed Daoud was president, you have this sort of like two-prong approach to Afghanistan. One was sort of providing aid and economic assistance to the government of Daoud, and on the other hand, there was that weapons program that was funneled through Iran and Pakistan to the opposition. And it was all in the name of sort of trying to lean the government of Daoud away from Soviet influence. And when the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the PDPA, took over in their April 1978 revolution, I think the American response was very similar. That was certainly more overtly pro-Soviet, and the leader of one of the factions of the PDPA, the Kalki faction, Hafizullah Amin, in the 1960s had studied for 4 years at Columbia University Teachers College. He was president of the Afghan Students Association at Columbia, and there was a number of allegations about CIA involvement in that program. When Hafizullah Amin went back to Afghanistan, I think he became principal of a school funded by a USAID program that was administered through the Teachers College. And that was certainly a cover for a number of CIA men in Afghanistan. That doesn't mean that Hafizullah Amin, this leader of the Kalki faction of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, was certainly a CIA asset himself. I think it's clear that he was not. But the Soviets absolutely feared that. They certainly were wrong about that. But, all the while during 1979, when they were considering going back and forth about deciding to invade or not, that was on their mind, certainly, that Hafizullah Amin was going to, quote, do a Sadat on us, which is a reference to how in the 1970s Egyptian President Anwar Sadat defected from the Soviet camp to side with Washington in the Cold War. And so in 79, the Soviets were definitely afraid that Hafizullah Amin was going to do something similar.
Yeah, that was interesting. I like the phrase too. It really kind of summarizes a lot into one sentence.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was also so at this point in time, our presence in the Middle East, Central Asia was, well, first of all, not anywhere near as big as it is right now.
Right.
But like, what were we doing at that point in time? Were we not paying that much attention? Did we have a small presence? We know that it changed a lot in the 1980s, but what was the situation at that point? Because that seems to be the other thing that the USSR was, the bigger thing they were trying to prevent.
For sure. At that time, I mean, the Carter administration was slowly beginning a military buildup in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf. The Iranian Revolution of January 1979, so this is 11 months before the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, certainly played a big role in motivating that shift for Carter. In response to the hostage crisis at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, Carter forms this rapid deployment force that I think eventually became JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command that we all know so well from the War on Terror. And so Carter is making a lot of moves in the Gulf at the time. And come January 1980, a couple weeks after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, in the State of the Union address, Carter essentially announces the Carter Doctrine, which is that the U.S. has interest in the Persian Gulf, and sort of any encroachment on the Persian Gulf by foreign powers, aka the Soviet Union, will be responded to militarily if needed. And so, you have deployment of more missiles to the Persian Gulf in 1979. One of those deployments in December 1979 really alarmed Soviet officials and definitely tipped the scale for them in terms of intervening.
Right. And then ultimately, they're talking about back to the Central Asia, they're worried about their borders with Afghanistan.
Right.
Which are direct borders at that point.
Underbelly.
Yeah. Which still talk about now. And even in the 90s, something I mention a lot, the conversation between Wolfowitz and Wes Clark that Wes Clark has made public about what their goals were, the infamous 7 countries in 5 years. And, a lot of people talk about that. They don't talk about the other thing that Wes Clark mentioned, which is that they said something like, we just want to change these, what he called Soviet client states. That's what they saw those countries as being. And And so I would say that the struggle is still going on right now, even though there is no more USSR, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'll turn over to you.
No, please go. Yeah, please. Whatever you're going to say, that's fine.
So, in conclusion, I mean, you respect the research that you are responding to, but you think it is another "we meant well," downplaying of the imperial nature of the American empire, or you could say the NATO empire, whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
That it's a downplaying of that, which is the forbidden topic. In recent years, very recent years, just the past few, really, could you even mention the name, or even propose that, hey, what we really are here is an empire? It was a weird thing. Like, probably the rest of the world saw us as an empire, but like at home, I would say most people didn't, because it was a different kind of empire, whatever. Mm-hmm. But you think that he underplayed that. Is that an accurate conclusion of what you said?
Yeah, I mean, in my piece, I do write that I think, Conor Tobin in his article unjustifiably downplays the role of U.S. policies in the ultimate decision by the Soviets to intervene. He has one argument. He has one interpretation of events. I have another. I would say they're both fairly plausible. I just think that my read of events is a little bit more accurate. He disagrees with me, and that's fine. I think I learned a lot from his article, and when he responded to my tweets, I think he said the same. I think that so what he tries to do is undermine the trap thesis, which is that Carter and Brzezinski tried to trap the Soviets into invading Afghanistan. And I think on that point he succeeds. But he has this larger goal of undermining criticism of U.S. policy in Afghanistan leading up to the invasion. A criticism that has put a lot of blame on Washington for the destruction of Afghanistan in the decade after and the 4 decades after. And I argue just by pointing out that Soviets did in fact greatly worry about U.S. involvement in Afghanistan throughout 1979, that it was a primary factor in motivating them to intervene. Yes, while the non-lethal aid program that Jimmy Carter authorized on July 3, 1979 was small, it certainly did provide a bit of strength to the insurgency. And we can't undercut the role of that. Moreover, as I mentioned earlier, we have these long destabilization efforts by the United States and Pakistan and Iran. And all of that combined with the sort of more strategic posturing by the Carter administration in 1979, I think that played a large role in the Soviet decision to intervene. So a lot of the Soviet diplomatic record, says this explicitly, that they were worried about, losing Afghanistan, right? After they won it in the 1978 revolution. They didn't want to lose sort of a communist government. They wanted to protect it. That's ultimately why they, of course, intervened. It was, that the regime of Hafizullah Amin at the time was very, very unstable. It was not doing a good job winning the sort of civil war against the insurgency. And that's why they intervened. They wanted to protect and secure a communist government. They intervened, they invaded and killed Hafizullah Amin and installed Barbara Karmal, who was the leader of the Partram faction of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the longtime favorite of Soviet largesse in Afghanistan. And so that's really why I wrote the piece, because I felt, while, yes, it's an excellent piece of historical analysis, it set the record straight on the trap thesis. At the same time, it maybe downplayed the U.S. role. It overcorrected is the word that I use.
Okay, yeah. So, bottom line, the 1998 interview with Brzezinski and his later walkbacks, do you feel that that's accurate? Do you think he was sort of misunderstood or cherry-picked in 1998?
I mean, who knows what Brzezinski actually believes, and he probably doesn't believe the same thing from one decade to the next. Who knows? But I think, in 1998, it was very advantageous for him to claim credit for having won the Cold War, essentially, right? And obviously, that's not necessarily true. I mean, it's definitely exaggeration to say that Brzezinski
one man,
destroyed the Soviet Union or whatever. But and even so, like the Soviet War did not play a huge role in the dissolution of the Soviet Union. I mean, it was there. It's certainly the Soviet Union could certainly afford the war. It wasn't an economic issue that brought the Soviet Union down. The economic portion of the Soviet war in Afghanistan that brought down the Soviet Union. So it's tough as a sort of question of historical accuracy to claim that Brzezinski helped bring down the Soviet Union. But more than that, he does, as you said, walk it back after 9/11, especially when he and Carter were getting criticism for giving rise to the Taliban and Al Qaeda eventually. He does sort of walk it back, and at that point, it is no longer politically advantageous to claim credit for having won the Cold War. When your country just got a missile jet launched at its big towers in New York, killing 3,000 people. So at that point, he has to walk things back, and so it's tough to really pin a coherency to Brzezinski's beliefs beyond just saying that he was trying to counter Soviet influence.
I mean, instinctively, I think a lot of people think, well, he was trying to take a little more credit for it when that was advantageous and less when it wasn't. I think they're probably right.
That's right.
All right. Well, this is a good way to roll into the bonus question, I think. Unless there's any other things you want to say before we do that.
No, I think I hit on why I wrote the piece, which I'm glad we got to.
Great. All right. So bonus question. We'll bring it forward to today a little bit. So Trump, assuming he's made it pretty clear he wants to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. You can question motives and all that, but it seems pretty clear that he does. He has faced staunch resistance to that, maybe even insubordination in recent years, especially recent months, because it would have been very politically advantageous for him to do that for his base. So he just fired the Secretary of Defense, and he installed Colonel McGregor as his advisor. And McGregor has made his views very clear. He wants out of Afghanistan. And the talk is that they're going to try to do it in the next 2 months. And the war hawks, and even who aren't typically war hawks, like some of the prominent Democrats, they've been out en masse on cable TV condemning what they call a premature withdrawal. That seems to be the talking point in the media, premature withdrawal, in the past week or so. So other than the obvious profiteering motives that we have for staying in Afghanistan, given that the population is about 80% against it, including military, I forget whether the poll was active and veteran. I think it was retired military. Opposes staying in Afghanistan. So other than the obvious profiteering motive, do you have any thoughts on why there is such a massive resistance to getting out of Afghanistan? I'm going to add a little bit to that. Like recently, John Brennan's been on the cable news talking about the need to remove Trump now from office because he's still got 70 days, a little less than that now, to do grave damage to our national security. Now, some people think he's afraid of things, that Trump's going to go rogue and reveal things about Brennan that are going to damage him personally.
Right.
But, other than that, he seems pretty confident that he's never going to be held accountable for anything. So he's probably talking about Afghanistan. All right. So I rambled on a little too long in that bonus question, but what are your thoughts about, other than the obvious profiteering, what are some of the other reasons why there'd be such a resistance to getting out of Afghanistan, which seems such an obvious answer, like we should do it? The answer to the bonus question is in the bonus segment for patrons. You can get access to these bonus segments. There's one for almost every interview by subscribing at Patreon. Plus, you get access to other patrons-only benefits and a Discord channel where we can talk among ourselves, do some Q&A live streams and such. So that's my tease. I hope some of you will join us. And now I'll continue with the interview wrap up. All right. Well, I need to let you go. Kept you too long. Anything else? I'm going to roll now back into the public part of the interview. So anything else that you might want to say before we wrap up?
No, not that I can think of. I'm very grateful that you had me on your program.
Yeah, it was great talking to you. And make sure you let people know how they can follow you, how they can find your work.
Sure. I'm on Twitter at Gunar Olsen. That's GUNAR OLSEN. There's a link to my website, gunarolsen.com, there where you can find all of my writing. You can subscribe to my newsletter if you'd like, which I send out when I publish something. Yeah, a number of ways to find my work.
Perfect. Thanks. And let's talk again soon.
Absolutely, Joanne. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening. Special thanks to Gunar Olsen. Follow him on Twitter, GUNAROLSEN. Also find him and his work at his website, gunarolsen.com. This podcast is independent media, so listener support's important. Patreon.com/AroundTheEmpire, PayPal.me/AroundTheEmpirePod. You can find it on any mobile podcast app or on the website, AroundTheEmpire.com, on Patreon, and on YouTube. And if you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to like, share, subscribe. Follow on Twitter @AroundTheEmpire, and we'll see you next time. Take good care, everybody.